Welcome to the Soulful Stories channel, and invite you to listen to our new author story. This story began about a month ago when our small group of 3 families decided to go on a nature retreat, bringing along our kids. We had been friends since college, and this bond, woven tightly over time, had withstood many stages of our lives. Most of us were around the same age, which created a special harmony in our relationships. However, there were 2 exceptions, 2 wives who were noticeably younger than their husbands. Their youthful energy and fresh outlook on life brought a unique atmosphere to our gatherings. My name is Sarah. On this trip, I was accompanied by my husband, John, and our 8-year-old twins. We had all known each other for a long time, sharing moments of happiness and life's hardships. Yet there was always something inexplicable lingering in the air. Among our friends was a couple with a 7-year-old daughter, while the other family had 2 sons, one was 7 and the other 8. Our group seemed to fit together perfectly. The children got along well, and the adults relished the rare moments of togetherness in nature. Despite the apparent idyll, I often found myself unable to completely let go of the past. Among our group, there was one person with whom I shared something more than just friendship. That person was Tom. We had met back in college, and I liked him a lot back then. But fate had other plans. By the time our paths crossed, he was already in a relationship with another woman, who eventually became his wife. I accepted that my hopes for him would never come true, though a slight sense of regret always lingered deep inside. Over time, after meeting John, I genuinely fell in love with him, and my previous feelings for Tom gradually faded. New emotions filled my heart, and life went on. However, memories of Tom would sometimes resurface. Strangely enough, this always seemed to happen during trips like this, when time slowed down and the family routine took a back seat. Away from the usual hustle and bustle, I felt I could allow myself a bit more than usual when talking to Tom. Of course, it was always within the bounds of propriety, under the watchful eyes of our children and spouses, to avoid raising any suspicions. By the time this trip happened, the relationship between my husband and me had grown significantly colder. Years of marriage, everyday struggles, and inevitable concerns had taken their toll. The passion had gradually faded, and mutual attention had given way to routine and habit. My husband no longer took care of himself as he once did when we first met. Back then, he had embodied confidence and attractiveness, always well-groomed and attentive. But the years had changed him. Now, before me was a very different person, absorbed in daily concerns, lacking the spark that had once drawn me to him. Against this backdrop, Tom, my friend's husband, stood out even more. He always looked impeccable, with perfect taste and style. His polished appearance wasn't just thanks to his wife, but also due to his high position at a prestigious company. His role at the local company required him to maintain a certain image, and he effortlessly embodied the persona of a successful and confident man. The contrast between him and my husband was particularly striking to me. While my husband was getting lost in the mundane routine of daily life, Tom still radiated the same charisma and allure I had once felt for him back in college. My attraction to Tom was inevitable. We often crossed paths at different gatherings and events, and each time, I caught myself unable to take my eyes off him. His confident demeanor, easygoing manner, and sense of style couldn't go unnoticed. On this trip, our group set up camp in a spacious area for tents, which gave me ample opportunity to strike up conversations with Tom, even if it seemed innocent. For me, the flirting was like a game, almost invisible to those around us, but deeply thrilling for me. Of course, I made sure not to cross any lines, acting cautiously to avoid raising suspicion from my husband or anyone else. When we arrived at the campsite and set up, the usual bustle began. The men lit the fire, we started preparing the meat, and the kids played nearby, surrounded by blankets and care. We enjoyed the pleasant company, had drinks, and gradually relaxed under the starry sky. As the alcohol took effect, the atmosphere around the campfire became more carefree. The firelight danced across the faces of our friends, and in these soft flickers, Tom seemed even more attractive to me. The warmth of the fire and the growing sense of intoxication made his presence even more vivid, almost magical. It felt like, in that moment, the world around us slowed down, leaving only our shadows swaying in the flickering light of the flames. Quiet laughter, casual conversations, the faint scent of cooking meat, all of it seemed like the backdrop for an unspoken dialogue between us, carried on without words. My husband suggested we head to bed, as the late hour and fatigue were beginning to show, but I didn't feel sleepy. Instead, the warmth of the fire, the soft crackling of the logs, and the gentle glow of the flames created an atmosphere in which I didn't want to part with the moment. I calmly replied that I would stay a little longer, wanting to linger in the stillness and peace. He didn't object, nodding in agreement, and as he helped our friends, he headed off to put the kids to bed. His movements were slow and steady, performing the familiar routine, unaware that a completely different story was starting to unfold around me. As the space around the campfire gradually emptied and the quiet of the night fully settled in, my hidden desires began to take hold of my thoughts with renewed intensity. I felt them more sharply than ever before. Every moment, every glance from Tom, his warm smile, seemed to be harbingers of something more. I noticed how he lingered, not rushing to follow his wife, who, having clearly had too much to drink, was barely able to stand. Tom escorted her to the tent, gently holding her hand, playing the same role my husband had just a few minutes earlier. But his eyes, his gestures were saying something entirely different to me. In that moment, I realized that our feelings were mutual. When everyone in our group, worn out from the long day and tipsy from the alcohol, had drifted off to sleep, Tom and I were left alone. The forest surrounding us felt like a shelter, where no one could see or hear us. In that moment, the silence was filled only with the crackling of the campfire and the soft rustling of leaves as the wind passed through them. I gathered the courage to invite Tom to sit next to me on the blanket. He readily agreed, his steps quick but tinged with a mix of shyness and anticipation. When he sat down, it was as if a spark flickered between us. His words, whispered softly in the stillness of the night, captivated me instantly. He started with compliments, his voice gentle and mesmerizing. Tom confessed that he had always admired me, that I had frequently crossed his mind no matter how hard he tried to suppress it. Almost as if in a dream, I heard him say that I was far more beautiful than his wife, that over the years his feelings for her had faded, while his attraction to me had only grown stronger. Those words felt like music in the night stillness. I was enchanted, as though entranced by his confessions. All the emotions I had kept buried for so many years suddenly surfaced. Every word he spoke stirred up memories of old desires and dreams I had long tried to forget. His compliments seemed genuine, and at that moment, I was ready to believe anything. Everything between Tom and me was filled with passion and desire, until the unexpected appearance of Vincent interrupted us. He had seemed to be peacefully asleep in his tent, wrapped around his wife, but suddenly emerged, perhaps to relieve himself. His figure glided silently through the night, and he came closer to the campfire where Tom and I were sitting, lost in each other. Vincent cast a calm glance at us, his lips curling into a slight smirk, as if what he saw was amusing or not worth making a fuss over. He gave a brief nod and, without saying a word, continued on his way. The moment cooled us down, but not enough for us to feel regret. Vincent had always been a reliable person, and deep down I knew he wouldn't make a scene or tell anyone what he had witnessed. We carried on as if nothing had happened, deciding not to waste time on unnecessary worries. The night was still young, and the desire that had built up over the years consumed us once again. However, our pleasure didn't last long. Just as we found ourselves in each other's arms again, Olivia's husband appeared from the neighboring tent. He clearly wasn't looking for us, but likely woke up from his wife's movements or decided to step out for some fresh air. His unexpected appearance shattered our romantic scene in an instant. Olivia was an impulsive woman with a keen sense of her surroundings. She immediately sensed that something was wrong, and although she had the presence of mind not to scream or raise alarm so as not to wake the children, her silence promised nothing good. We were grateful for that. Despite her obvious outrage, her motherly instincts and concern for the children's peace prevailed. But her eyes were flashing with anger, and even in the dim light, it was clear she was seething. Olivia didn't waste any time. Turning sharply, she burst into the tent where my husband was sleeping and began whispering urgently and desperately about betrayal and infidelity. Her words were jumbled but comprehensible. My husband, still half asleep and clearly irritated at being abruptly woken, jumped to his feet. His head was still heavy from the wine, and he blinked and swayed, trying to grasp what was happening, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation. Meanwhile, Tom and I, realizing that the situation was now beyond our control, quickly tried to compose ourselves. I felt a wave of shame wash over me, accompanied by the realization that everything we had just experienced was meant to remain a secret in the night. But the night was no longer a refuge for us. Olivia, with her characteristic determination, didn't stop at merely informing my husband of what had happened. Ensuring her words had reached their target and stirred his anger, she decided to take things further. Outraged, Olivia began to shake Ina, trying to drag her out of the tent as if to summon another witness to our disgrace. But her attempts were in vain. Ina was too drunk, her consciousness floating somewhere far away, and she couldn't even properly react to the shaking Olivia was trying to administer. Perhaps this was a strange stroke of luck for us. In her condition, Ina wouldn't be able to fully comprehend the situation, and deep down, I hoped we could explain things to her more clearly in the morning when her mind was sober and calm. Meanwhile, my husband, listening to Olivia's torrent of words, was slowly coming to realize that this was not nonsense or a lie, but a harsh truth. His gaze, clouded by alcohol, gradually cleared, and when he grasped the full extent of my betrayal, a spark of fury ignited in his eyes. He moved swiftly towards Tom and, without hesitation, delivered a powerful punch to his face, slicing through the night's silence and disrupting the soothing crackle of the fire. Tom barely managed to stay on his feet but did not defend himself or argue. Perhaps he knew he deserved that blow. But my husband's anger didn't end there. He turned to me, his teeth clenched with rage, and grabbed me by the hair, pulling me forcefully toward our tent as if he wanted to isolate me from the entire disgraceful scene as quickly as possible. I didn't resist. The weight of guilt pressed down on me like a heavy burden, and I no longer saw the point in saying anything or trying to justify myself. We both knew that nothing would ever be the same after what had happened. It felt as if we were teetering on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move could plunge us into an abyss. Inside the tent, my husband threw me to the ground without saying a word and sat down beside me, breathing heavily from the emotions that overwhelmed him. I quietly asked him not to shout, fearing that our children might wake up and witness this terrible moment. He didn't shout. Instead, his face twisted in pain and despair. He cradled his head in his hands, as if unable to bear the storm of feelings that had engulfed him. In the stillness of the night, he began to speak, initially quietly, then louder, unleashing his insults and deep regrets upon me. He spoke of lost years, how much we had missed, how I had betrayed his trust and shattered our marriage. Each of his words struck me like a lash, but I no longer felt the pain. Everything now seemed meaningless. I sat beside him, silently listening to his bitter reproaches, realizing that my feelings had long since become too complicated and tangled to try to sort out. I felt indifferent. It was only now that I understood how, years ago, when Tom and Ina first started dating, I should have acted differently. If I hadn't been afraid to fight for my feelings back then, perhaps all this drama could have been avoided. Yes, I might have lost a friend, but I would have kept my happiness. But now I had lost everything. A friend, a husband, and Tom. Over the years, so many mistakes, unspoken words, and hidden desires had accumulated that it seemed this trip had merely brought to light all the problems we had been trying to ignore for years. The next evening, the four of us adults gathered to have a serious talk. It was inevitable. After what had happened, remaining silent would only worsen our already painful rifts. This time, we decided to have the conversation without any outside witnesses, not for secrecy, but for privacy, so everyone could speak freely without the discomfort of an outsider's gaze. Olivia, still seething with indignation, tried to intervene, as always, with a desire to give advice and steer the conversation in what she thought was the right direction. But we quickly realized that her involvement wouldn't be helpful, so we tactfully but firmly asked her to step back. Left alone with Tom and his wife, we faced our fears and disappointments, our pain and bitterness accumulated over many years. To my surprise, Tom's wife didn't cause a scene. I had expected her feelings to spill out. Anger, jealousy, humiliation. But she remained calm and composed, her gaze reflecting strength. A strong woman, she had always sensed that something was amiss in our circle of relationships, that there were hidden tensions that weren't always concealed by the veneer of outward prosperity. Perhaps she was simply waiting for her moment to finally bring closure to this tangled story. We all knew that the situation had gone too far, that what had happened couldn't just be swept under the rug as if nothing had occurred. None of us knew how to move forward, what to say, or what decisions to make. We simply sat in uncomfortable silence, looking at each other, each with our own resentments, bitterness, and perhaps shame. We were all deeply hurt, not only by what had happened, but also by the fact that our dreams of family life, love, and understanding had shattered into pieces. No one immediately mentioned divorce. It was as if it hung in the air, requiring no further words. Eventually, we realized that continuing to pretend to be a normal family was no longer possible. An unspoken agreement was reached. We would officially divorce, and each of us would go our separate ways. We could no longer live together, maintaining the illusion of happiness that had long since been destroyed. But there was one important factor remaining: our children. No matter how painful our personal relationships were, we all understood that for their sake, we needed to maintain the appearance of family well-being. Our children were not to blame for what had happened between us. We loved them with all our hearts and knew that their well-being had to remain a priority. I knew that neither my husband nor Tom would ever forgive me for destroying their trust, for jeopardizing our friendship and families. But I had already come to terms with that. Perhaps now I had a chance to build the life I had dreamed of for so long. A life where my desires and feelings would come first. A life in which I could be myself, not who others wanted me to be. After our return, I couldn't immediately leave the past behind. A part of me still clung to those elusive hopes I had cherished despite the pain and disappointment. My husband and I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the sake of the children, continued to interact with Tom and his family, even though our relationships had changed forever. Each meeting with him was filled with unspoken words, heaviness, and awkwardness. But something inside me still wouldn't let go. Perhaps it was the feeling of an unfulfilled dream or something I had created for myself, desperately trying to reclaim what had never truly been mine. One day, I took a desperate step and invited Tom to meet, hoping to finally clear the air. I thought maybe there was a chance for something real, that our connection wasn't just a random mistake. But this meeting, which could have answered my inner questions, turned out to shatter my last illusions. Tom, with the same ease and charm that had once drawn me to him, candidly admitted that he could no longer continue this charade. He revealed that my story wasn't the first in his life, that he had cheated on his wife before, and that each time it followed the same pattern, which unfortunately had worked on me as well. At that moment, everything inside me collapsed. The feelings I had believed were real turned out to be just another illusion. My heart was shattered, not only from realizing that I was just one of many, but also from understanding how low I had fallen in my pursuits. In an instant, I lost everything that truly mattered to me. Tom was not the person I had loved in my dreams, and my husband, the one who had been by my side all these years, now hated me for my betrayal. All that remained of who I once was were the children, the only connection to the past that I couldn't and didn't want to sever. After that meeting with Tom, I finally realized how much pain I had caused my husband. All these years, he had been my support, my reliable anchor keeping me afloat when life became difficult. And now, in search of fleeting passions, I had traded him for a cheap romance that turned out to be nothing but bitter disappointment. That day, completely broken, I returned home. I remember in a surge of despair, with tears in my eyes, throwing myself at my husband and begging him to forgive me for everything that had happened between us. I pleaded for him to give me a chance to make amends, told him I realized what a huge mistake I had made, and that I was willing to do anything to save our relationship. He remained silent for a long time, and I saw the struggle between love and hurt in his eyes. He confessed that he still loved me, but also said honestly that he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive me for betraying him so cruelly. The thought of having destroyed the most precious thing we had hurt him deeper than I could have ever imagined. And now, despite the remaining love, he doubted whether it was possible to restore the feelings that had been shattered. I knew that my actions had dealt him an irreparable blow. His trust in me had been torn to shreds, and I couldn't expect it to be easily mended. All I could do at that moment was hope that time might heal these wounds, and that someday we could start anew. But right now, in that silence, I understood that it would be a long road, and that many obstacles might lie ahead.